The fires were already burning when the first wave of German bombers reached the Bristol Channel on the night of November 2, 1940. From 3,000 feet, through scattered cloud and the haze of their own exhaust, the Luftwaffe navigators saw exactly what they expected: the unmistakable glow of a city under blackout, its docks and railways betrayed by the orange flicker of flames and the occasional flash of an explosion. They had found their target. Bristol, one of Britain's most vital ports, lay beneath them like a gift. The lead bombardier made his final corrections, adjusted for wind and altitude, and released his payload. 40 tons of high-explosive and incendiary bombs fell through the darkness toward what every man in that formation believed was the beating heart of Britain's Western war effort. They were wrong. They had just bombed a field. What those German crews attacked with such confidence was not Bristol at all, but an elaborate deception built from scaffolding, oil drums, and controlled fire. A phantom city standing in the Somerset countryside, raised to draw death away from the real one. It was called a Starfish site, and it would become one of the most audacious, least-known defensive miracles of the Second World War. By late 1940, Britain stood alone against Hitler's war machine. France had fallen, Norway was gone, Poland erased. The Luftwaffe ruled Europe's skies, and across the Channel its bombers crossed each night to strike at the cities that kept Britain alive. The Blitz had begun. London burned, Coventry was shattered, Liverpool's docks glowed like molten metal, and inside the Air Ministry there was a grim realization. Bravery alone could not stop the bombs. Fighter Command had held the daylight skies during the Battle of Britain, but at night, radar was primitive, interception rare. Anti-aircraft fire groped blindly into darkness. Civil defense workers could only rescue and rebuild what survived. Britain needed not just courage, but cunning. If the bombs could not be stopped, perhaps they could be moved. Colonel John Turner, a quiet engineer within the Directorate of Air Defense, was given an impossible assignment: protect Britain's industrial cities from annihilation without a single extra fighter or gun. Turner was no showman, but he possessed what war demanded most: imagination under pressure. He studied the Luftwaffe's methods. German night bombers were precise by 1940 standards, guided by radio beam systems such as Knickebein and X-Jarrett that brought them to within miles of their targets. But final bombing runs still relied on the human eye, navigators confirming their position by the glow of burning docks or the pattern of rivers and railways below. If those visual cues could be forged elsewhere, perhaps whole bombing raids could be lured away. It was an absurd, desperate thought: build fake cities to burn. Yet absurdity often becomes strategy when annihilation is the alternative. Turner assembled a team drawn from an unlikely alliance: film studio set designers, BBC lighting engineers, pyrotechnic experts, and civil engineers. These were not soldiers but artists of perception, men who knew how light, color, and shadow could reshape what the eye believed. Their mission was to build decoys so convincing that trained enemy crews, flying missions they had practiced for months, would drop their bombs on empty farmland and never know the difference. The code name chosen was poetic: Starfish, short for special fire. Before anything could be built, Turner's team had to learn how a city looked while dying. They studied aerial photographs of Coventry and Southampton, noting how industrial fires spread, how light diffused through smoke, how reflections from rivers and docks framed the chaos. Oil fires glowed deep orange, timber blazes flickered white-yellow, while collapsing roofs produced intermittent flashes. From that grim research came a blueprint: light, motion, and texture arranged to imitate catastrophe. Each Starfish site was positioned with surgical precision. Intelligence officers analyzed Luftwaffe flight paths, the routes they habitually followed toward Bristol, Portsmouth, or Glasgow. The decoy had to sit along that approach, close enough to seem plausible yet far enough to protect civilians. Once a hillside or field was chosen, engineers recreated the geometry of the real city. Long lines of metal troughs were laid out in street grid patterns, filled with mixtures of crude oil, creosote, and coal. When ignited, they produced deep, pulsing flames like row houses engulfed in fire. Smaller baskets of wood shavings soaked in paraffin mimicked incendiaries striking neighborhoods. Shallow water tanks mirrored the glow, imitating docks or canals. The control system was ingenious but simple. Electrical cables connected each fire group to a central bunker, a squat concrete shelter buried beneath turf, manned by 4 or 5 operators. When the observer corps reported incoming bombers, the site crew waited in total darkness, telephones crackling with coded orders from regional command. Timing was everything. If the fires were lit too early, German navigators would spot 2 Bristols or Portsmouths, and no one was false. Too late, and the real city would already be in flames. The operators had to strike the balance perfectly, usually igniting their decoy just as the first Pathfinder bombs hit the genuine target, then building intensity to lure the following waves. The system's trial came not at Bristol but at Portsmouth in January 1941. Intelligence indicated a heavy naval dockyard raid was imminent. As dusk fell, air raid sirens moaned across the city. In a bunker 12 miles inland, a handful of men, technicians, not soldiers, prepared to gamble their lives on illusion. At 21 hours, radar tracked the first Pathfinders crossing the coast. Moments later, incendiaries began to fall over Portsmouth's harbor. That was the cue. The decoy operators threw their switches. Across 10 acres of farmland, a chain of fires erupted in precise sequence. The dock area, the railway yards, then scattered residential hits. From the ground it looked absurd. Piles of burning fuel in the middle of empty fields. But from 3,000 feet, through smoke and night, it looked exactly like a city dying. The German bombers came in formation, saw the conflagration, and began to drop. For 3 hours, high explosives and incendiaries rained down on the decoy site. Sheep were vaporized. Hedgerows vanished. A tractor disappeared into a crater. But Portsmouth, the real Portsmouth, stood largely untouched. By dawn, investigators counted more than 200 craters across the decoy fields. The experiment had worked. Word spread quietly through the Air Ministry. If Portsmouth could be saved by fire and smoke, so could Bristol, Cardiff, Liverpool, Manchester, Sheffield, and Glasgow. Within weeks, orders were issued to construct a national network of decoys, each tailored to the geography and industrial pattern of its twin city. Some Starfish sites covered 50 acres, others only 10, but all shared the same core illusion. Controlled chaos, carefully choreographed. Workers labored in secrecy. Farmers whose land was requisitioned were told only that special defense work was underway. Every participant signed the Official Secrets Act. Even local firefighters were kept uninformed. They could not risk accidentally dousing the very flames that saved their city. Operating a starfish site was among the war's strangest and most dangerous jobs. The men inside the bunkers, often middle-aged technicians or volunteers unfit for frontline service, had to wait in silence as the bombers approached. They listened to engines overhead, felt the shock of explosions, and held steady until the right moment to ignite their fake inferno. There were no defenses, no guns, only a few feet of concrete between them and obliteration. A single misaimed bomb could erase the entire crew. At Exeter, one direct hit on a control bunker killed all 3 operators instantly. Their deaths were recorded simply as accidents. No one outside their circle ever knew what they had done. And yet they kept lighting the fires, night after night, across blacked-out Britain, because each false blaze meant another neighborhood left standing by morning. The smoke from those first successful decoys had a way of changing how the enemy thought. German after-action reports began to show something remarkable: bomb damage in places that did not exist. Reconnaissance photographers, peering down the next morning, found cratered fields and smoldering hedgerows and reported them as destroyed industrial works. Luftwaffe intelligence catalogued factories and railheads that were nothing but canvas frames and rusted piping. The illusion did more than divert bombs. It rewrote the enemy's understanding of the campaign. Planners in Berlin believed they had smashed production lines. In reality, the real factories, docks, and machine shops kept turning out engines, shells, and aircraft parts. The decoys were not only absorbing bombs, they were buying time, keeping the machinery of war working while convincing the adversary he had already won. As Starfish multiplied, so did the engineering sophistication beneath the theatrics. Turner's team and their collaborators learned from every raid. They studied the enemy's approach vectors and photographic reconnaissance. They fine-tuned the spacing of oil troughs to mimic the rhythm of terraced streets. They adjusted the intensity of flame to reflect the difference between a timber quarter and a concrete industrial zone. When German Pathfinder units used radio beams such as Nicobine or X-Juret to get into the correct corridor, navigators still needed visual confirmation. A particular bend in a river, a docklight here, a gasometer's silhouette there. British intelligence used this dependency against them. The Starfish planners mapped every salient. River bends, railway junctions, even hedgerow patterns, and placed reflectors, tanks, and linear fires in precisely those positions so that, from altitude and speed, the visual signature matched the expected target. They even engineered controlled flashes to simulate high explosive impacts. Small timed charges, fired in sequence, created the staccato punctuation of a bombing run. The bright white bursts a pilot might expect when an armor-piercing shell detonated a warehouse, the brief bloom of heat followed by smothering smoke. Some sites experimented with mirror arrays to throw a transient glint across a water tank, recreating the way a dockyard's wet surfaces might flash under bombardment. Others wired banks of small bulbs behind perforated metal to imitate the pulse of street lamps under strain. None of it was glamorous. Most of it was back-of-house engineering, metallurgy and plumbing, and greasy, hand-wound switches in concrete bunkers. But the cumulative effect was devastatingly effective. Consider Sheffield, where the Starfish planners faced a particular challenge. The city's industrial character was compact and intense, with steelworks that threw their own unique heat signatures into the night. The decoy for Sheffield was therefore not a single field of flames, but a mosaic. Long troughs for the rolling mills, smaller baskets for housing, and reflecting pools to suggest the dawn's dark ribbons. During one major raid, radar plots and post-raid intelligence indicated that roughly half the bomber stream had been enticed away by such a decoy, leaving the real steelworks with far less damage than intelligence had predicted. In Manchester and Liverpool, decoys mimicked dockside reflections and the long linear glow of warehouses. In Glasgow, the sites suggested the outline of shipyards, slipways, and oil tanks. Each imitation required a different recipe of fuel, ignition timing, and layout. The builders kept meticulous notes, evolving the art into a near science. The human cost of the deception, when it came due, was neither abstract nor small. Starfish crews were not anonymous cogs. They were living people who, like their counterparts fighting in the factories or on the beaches, took daily risks. Many were older men exempted from frontline service, veterans with arthritis or lost limbs, or younger volunteers who had technical skills but were not soldiers. Their work was lonely and surreal. By day they were plumbers, stagehands, or BBC technicians. By night they became pyrotechnicians and primitive stage managers for a theater meant to survive bombing campaigns. They lived in small concrete bunkers, their faces lit by maps and oily lamps, their ears filled with the distant thud of explosions and the nearer tremor of falling bombs. When the decoy had to be lit, they pulled levers that set oil alight and, minutes later, watched tracer-streaked darkness become a magnet for the enemy, knowing the bombs they drew away were going to land somewhere else. On quiet mornings, exhausted and soot-stained, they would inspect cratered ground and count the cost. A trench where a hedgerow had stood, a stump of a hedgerow charred and split, the ragged iron rim of a corroded oil drum sticking up from the soil like a relic. Not every night ended in success. At Exeter, a direct hit penetrated a control bunker and killed multiple operators, their names reduced to dry entries in local mortality lists. At an early site in the West Country, operators once misread an approach vector and lit the decoy too early. German reconnaissance overflew and reported 2 conflagrations, prompting a tactical review. The Starfish planners incorporated these lessons ruthlessly. They improved radio links with radar and observer corps reporting. They introduced coded procedures for staggered ignition and fail-safes for misfires. They trained crews in the art of ambiguity, how to light a fire that was convincing but not so theatrical as to attract enemy attention to the false site itself before the main wave arrived. The balance was delicate and at times brittle. The program's success also created a long-running ethical paradox. Britain's deception shielded whole neighborhoods and industrial complexes, yet it did so by turning the countryside into a battlefield. Sheep, cattle, and the livelihoods of rural communities were sometimes consumed for the sake of cities. A tractor might be swallowed by a crater. A hedgerow could become a mass of shrapnel-riddled roots. Farmland was scarred. The men and women who grew crops for a nation that was starving sometimes found their fields requisitioned for the sake of burning. But in late 1940 and early 1941, when survival was black and white, many accepted the calculus: if the farm could trick a bomber away from a dockyard, the smoke that rose above the field was a necessary sacrifice. As the Starfish network grew, so did its secondary effects. German reconnaissance reports sometimes overestimated their success and, as a result, redirected mission planning based on false intelligence. If Berlin believed a key engine plant had been neutralized in one night, it might deprioritize further attacks there or adjust target lists that fit the illusion. The deception thus performed a double duty: immediate protection through physical misdirection and strategic cover through erroneous enemy belief. The Germans, sophisticated and technically able though they were, relied on confirmation as much as on instruments. They saw what they wanted to see and reported it with confidence. British intelligence used that to its advantage. Yet the effectiveness of Starfish ebbed as the war shifted. By 1943 and into 1944, Allied air superiority and changes in German tactics began to reduce the relative importance of visual deception. Better radar, improved night fighting techniques, and the attrition of Luftwaffe crews meant fewer mass night attacks on British cities. Later in the war, the Germans developed unmanned weapons and cruise-style rockets, the V-1 flying bombs, which navigated without human visual confirmation and therefore were largely immune to the kind of trickery Starfish exploited. The decoy sites remained useful for a time, but technology and strategy moved on. The Ghost Britain of troughs and tanks was a tactical innovation whose window, for all its brilliance, could not remain open forever. When the war ended, the services that had run Starfish dissolved into peacetime anonymity. The Official Secrets Act held tightly. Men who had operated the decoys returned to their lives, sometimes never speaking of their work even to their closest family. Bunkers were bulldozed or left to be swallowed by soil and brush. Oil troughs were dismantled. Metal frames rusted and collapsed. In many places, the land slowly healed. The soil, cleaned and seeded, returned to wheat and pasture. But in other places, the earth remembered. Odd depressions that refused to plow flat. Mysterious patches where grass grew differently. A ring of stones that hinted at something placed there and then removed. Farmers found crumbling concrete foundations under new hedgerows. Once, an old man in a village 30 miles from where he now lived found, while digging a potato patch, an old blackened oil drum and a charred wooden post that told a story he had not been told as a boy. The secrecy endured for decades. Only in the later 20th century, as files were declassified and historians pried apart interdepartmental cables, did the full scale of the Starfish program emerge. The picture that came into focus was one of remarkable national improvisation, an engineering response that drew from theater, broadcasting and pyrotechnics to defend cities with nothing more glamorous than reflected light and burning oil. Scholars estimated that across the country the decoys had absorbed thousands of tons of bombs. Exact figures remain elusive. Many records were destroyed to prevent post-war exploitation, and some documentation was never compiled in ways that modern statisticians could easily parse. But the forensic record in the fields, and in the fragmented reports of wartime intelligence, was persuasive. Starfish had worked. Beyond the immediate calculations of bombs diverted and factories spared, the legacy of Starfish rippled into later forms of deception and camouflage. During the Cold War, militaries perfected decoy and deception techniques to mislead satellites and reconnaissance aircraft. Inflatable tanks that mimicked armored divisions, false airstrips with painted runways, radio signature spoofing that confounded eavesdropping. Electronic warfare, in a sense, is an extension of the same strategic insight. If you can make your opponent see something false, you can shape their actions. The Starfish planners had understood that first, in darkness, and with far less sophisticated instruments. They had weaponized illusion. There is, in the story of Starfish, a moral texture that complicates straightforward triumphalism. The program did not kill fewer Germans by design. It saved British lives by diverting bombs to empty fields, often at the cost of livestock and quiet farms. It turned inferno into mercy. For the men who crouched in concrete bunkers pulling switches, the act of lighting false fires in the middle of fields must have felt like a prayer, an uncertain, combustible plea that the enemy's vision could be bent. Their courage was quiet, unheroic in the cinematic sense, not a charge across a beach or a dogfight in the sky, but a willingness to stand in harm's way and make the impression of a city's death so convincing that the enemy would spend his ordnance on a lie. A peculiar, almost poetic inversion emerges when you think of those smoke-laced nights. The Luftwaffe crews peered down and believed themselves victorious. They thought they had inflicted ruin, that their bombs had flattened yards and warehouses and the people inside them. Yet the reality below their bomb sites was a British ingenuity that turned deception into salvation. The enemy's triumph was, in microcosm, the British victory. The bombs that fell and detonated in empty fields were, paradoxically, proof of a different kind of endurance. The ability to think creatively under existential pressure. Over time, historians and documentary makers began to tell the story properly. Books were written. A handful of veterans, operators, builders, farmers who had leased their land, spoke under the protective covenant of late declassification, describing the smell of oil on the wind, the way the night would bloom orange and then go silent. Archaeologists recorded traces. Concrete bunkers mapped with GPS, chains of filled-in craters visible in aerial surveys, rusted artifacts recovered from plow soils. These material traces corroborated archive narratives and brought texture to histories that might otherwise have remained abstract. The evidence is modest and local, but it accumulates into a national picture, one of improvisation, sacrifice, and technical artistry. And yet, for all the engineering and the quiet heroism, Starfish's most lasting lesson is human and moral. War is usually measured by weapons deployed, by territory seized, by tanks and planes counted. But sometimes the decisive edge is not the greatest caliber or the most devastating bomb. It is the capacity to see through an enemy's expectations and to exploit them. The knack for turning perception into a shield. The men who arranged troughs of oil in Somerset did not build monuments. They built a protection that only functioned if it remained secret. They chose invisibility as the price of effectiveness. If you walk across parts of rural Britain today, you will rarely find a plaque that tells this story. There are no grand memorials to the Starfish operators on the scale of naval memorials or Air Force cairns. The countryside is generous in its capacity to forget, and perhaps that is fitting. Starfish's power lay in disguise, in its ability to be misread. But if you stand at dusk on an old ridge and watch the light thin over distant farms, consider the possibility that some of those fields were once designed to look like ruin on purpose. Fields that sacrificed their own peace so that cities could sleep. Consider, too, that some of the most critical acts of resistance in human history occur not in the blaze of glory, but in the patient cunning that averts catastrophe. There is a haunting, quiet beauty to the thought that the brightest lights in this story were never meant to be seen. They were lit so others would not see the towns they loved reduced to rubble. They were the work of men and women who took the tools of theater and broadcasting, electric lamps, painted surfaces, timed explosions, and bent them toward one purpose: protection. The Starfish sites belong to a class of wartime responses that place craft and ingenuity at the center of survival. They remind us that when confronted with existential threats, societies do not respond only with stockpiled steel or explosive power. They respond with improvisation grounded in knowledge, community, and moral resolve. The men in concrete bunkers chose a form of courage less glamorous but no less heroic: the courage to act in the shadows and to keep silent afterward so that the deception might persist, its effectiveness preserved by secrecy. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, the quiet heroism, the ingenuity, the invisible courage, share this history with someone who loves the truth behind war's illusions. Because remembrance begins with understanding, and some of the brightest lights in history were never meant to be seen.